Hi, I'm Anderson Brown. I want to talk to you today about Zen. I'm going to talk about a particular Zen thinker, a real source of Zen, of what we mean by Zen, in fact. And as you know, in these videos, I don't want to be either too popular or too scholarly. I mean, you just think about our kind of popular culture memes about Zen, your moment of Zen, a kind of moment when meaningfulness sort of drops away and you find yourself kind of in the moment. And that is a sort of pop culture meme joke and cliche, but it also has some basis in the truth of Zen teaching. Anyway, what we're going to talk about today is Dogen. He is a Japanese Buddhist of the 13th century. And I think you'll see as we go over Dogen and his thought a little bit today, that he really is very much the avatar of this kind of stereotype of sort of Japanese Zen Buddhism that we have. He's really the source, really influential. And there's a reason why some of these people are influential. In our study of Buddhism this year, we've looked at Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and we've looked at Nagarjuna. Now we're looking at Dogen. All three of these people are enormously talented. In the case of Dogen, particularly his poetry and his writing, like a lot of the Tibetan notable Buddhists like Milarepa and others. It's a very much a literary form that has distinguished them. So, all right, so we're going to talk about Dogen. We're going to talk about Dogen and his great book, the Shobogenzo. So let's get on with that today. There it is. Get right to it. Hello. There we go. Oops. Okay. No. I screwed this up so bad. Mary. All right. Dogen, Japanese Zen master. Okay. So born in, he's again very much the 13th century, born in the 1200. The story is that he came from a noble family, but he was an illegitimate son, so he wasn't at the court or in the noble society. His mother passed away when he was a child, about 7, and as was common maybe for an upper class young man, particularly at that time, he was sent to the monastery. As Japanese, upper class Japanese young men in the 13th century commonly did, the way that, say, a Roman young man might go to Athens, a Japanese noble was sent to China, to the city in China for a proper classical education, and that happened to Dogen. He went to China, where he began his philosophical journey. He was ordained a Buddhist priest when he was 14, although Dogen tells us it was quite late in life, when he was an older person, at least in his 30s or 40s, that he felt he had real experience of enlightenment. Well, of course, that's not an unusual thing. Dogen is the founder of the Soto school of Japanese Buddhism. It is still very much alive with over 10 million adherents in Japan today. As always, my interest here is largely with his philosophical thinking and his other cultural achievements. The last bullet point on the slide there, as I say, he really was a major literary figure. I'm not going to talk too much about the koan sayings today in this video. It's sort of a whole other topic. Dogen felt, just for the bibliographic record, that the koans are short sayings that are supposed to impart wisdom. And we're talking about sort of the ideology behind all that today in this video. And Dogen was not satisfied very much with the koans, and he thought that they came at the expense of the community not paying as much attention to the classical sutras and the sutra literary form as they should. Dogen actually worked both writing sutras and writing koans. And the other thing about Dogen, again, he's educated, he has a classical Chinese education, he's back in Japan, and he's working with the Japanese language. Typically, Buddhist studies, Buddhist writings, and art were all in the Chinese language. Dogen was a pioneer in that he developed the Japanese language as a Buddhist language, writing both sutras and koans and many other writings. The Shobogenzo is a very large thing. I have the first couple volumes of maybe an 8-volume paperback edition and translation in English. It's very large. It's everything that he was compiling. He has several other writings, but the Shobogenzo, the treasure of the true Dharma Eye. The true Dharma Eye, by the way, it refers to the idea that what can be said or what can be understood at an intellectual level is not the real vision that Buddhist enlightenment has. The true Dharma eye is the eye that is not a construction out of intellectual ideas or concepts or that kind of thing. So that's the idea of the subtitle of the Shobogenzo, the treasury of the true Dharma eye. A funny thing, and people don't, people have, at least people that are in the Western Hemisphere where I live, tend to have sort of romanticized, sort of fuzzy ideas about Buddhism. Um, I was talking to my class on Eastern religion and philosophy the other day about how if I was teaching Christianity the way that I teach Buddhism, looking at some of the original sources and talking about some of the ideals and the philosophy, I wouldn't be surprised if a student said, well, that sounds okay for thinking about, but it's not really a very realistic thing. And I think people have that same impression when they find out about Buddhism from a distance. Buddhism, curiously, look, let me step out of this just for a second. We have this another sort of meme or stereotype in our popular culture about feudal Japan, about medieval Japan. Medieval Japan comes from the same period. That's what the slide I'm about to get back to is talking about. That is, you have the old royal systems in Japan get superseded by growth and economic change, as is usual in the course of history, and you get these emergence of the agrarian feudal rules of the various samurai who were really sort of military governors, and the rise of the samurai class. Of course, it's this incredibly charismatic, famous sort of cultural period in China, like cowboys and Indians in the United States or something like that. There's endless kinds of movies and sagas. It's all very charismatic and it's daring do and so on. And a very interesting period indeed in China and in Japan, I'm sorry, and one where we look at the design, textile, ceramics, painting, all kinds of stuff. We find a really great explosion of art during this period too, because it's an unsettled period. But these samurai are Buddhists, and so the popular image of what samurais are and the popular image of what Buddhists are kind of is at odds. But actually, it's important to understand, and I think to understand Dogen particularly, to understand the relationship between the kinds of conditions in medieval Japan that gave rise to a kind of militarized warrior state on the one hand, and gave rise to a lot of innovation and variation in Buddhism on the other. So getting back to that then, the Kamakura era, as you see now again, Dogen lives in the 13th century, 1200 to 1250s, so right in the middle of this era. As I say, you had an old kingdom. Remember Japan, I had mentioned that the upper class Japanese men were sent to China for their education. Japan coming into this period is a rural place. It's mountains, it's forests, it's remote. It's not they live in this shadow of China that way. But that's changing. Japan is growing. Japan is starting to have urban concentrations, and Japan is starting to have a larger and more various economy. So so you get then this period of change where the old royal order is overthrown, and what you get really are not so much new royalty as this kind of shogunate, which is a sort of more or less organized warlordism. It's a military government, I think, is what we would call it if we found it today in an Asian or South American or any other country, someplace. Where there was this kind of class, and you had to get in, and it was a military class. So then that second bullet point, you get this again historically famous and iconic samurai warrior class. They were Buddhists. That is remarkable. But notice that the idea was that these samurais were the professional, sort of masterly people who had a lot of self-discipline and education. I mean, the samurai had some status not only as a warrior or as an authority, like a police authority, but the samurais had sort of a status as gurus or professors or something like that too. They were taken to be educated people who were competent and knew about a lot of different things. They were kind of like a Brahmanic class, a very fairly militarized one. And so Buddhist practice was very important to them. It wasn't just incidental that these people were Buddhists, because Buddhism has that great emphasis on the transcendence of the material self and the body, in favor of awareness that transcends the delusions of the ego. Okay, I think we've talked about it enough that you know what I mean when I say that stuff. So you have in Japan during this time, the Kamakura era, right there on that 13th century where Dogen lives, where you have political dislocations, social dislocations, and the emergence of new structures, new classes of people. And this is also what's happening with the Buddhist community and Buddhist practice in Japan at that same time, which, as I already said, is completely involved in all of this. Dogen is an independent thinker. As I already mentioned, he has a critical mind. He's not happy with what he sees as decadent or decayed practices. He's invited to have a temple, a more centrally located urban temple. People would ally with him. It's all very political, who's running these lineages in these temples in this Buddhist society. But Dogen elects not to do that. He elects to have a temple far to the north and far away from these centers where he can work on his own practices and his own ideas. Very much a philosopher, but very much also a period of this era, the Kamakura era, where things are shaking up and things are becoming various. Things are moving off in different directions. It's a time of emergence. And so not coincidental then that we get this Zen thinker who takes the tradition in new ways. So, okie dokie then. So a little more background then, coming from China again, Bodhidharma by legend, bringing Buddhism into China, into Taoist and Confucian China, somewhere in the first part of the first millennium, maybe 3rd, 4th century of the Common Era. And then what happens is that that second bullet point there, what happens, among other things, you get a distinction between the Northern and Southern Chan schools. Zen is just the Japaneseification of the Chinese word Chan, which just means meditation as far as I can tell. But you have a argument, let me step out of it for a second, because it is very, very much similar. I mean, to the argument we have with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. That is the argument, the Calvinists, it's the argument between works and grace. In the Christian tradition, the argument between works and grace is, do you prove yourself worthy of being led into God's kingdom through your actions? Or is that blasphemous in as much as it's God who's going to decide who is saved? And the way that works in Chinese Chan Buddhism is this argument about whether or not enlightenment is something that you have to work very hard, very goal-directed, kind of a lot of discipline in order to achieve it, or whether, again, that is blasphemous and reflects a lack of understanding about what enlightenment really is. Okay, so, and the dilemma is as follows, the third bullet point on that slide there, that humans have an inherently enlightened Bodhi nature. Buddha has a positive view of human nature. People are basically good. It's only that through the cycle of craving and satisfaction, the 12-point cycle of dependent arising, the second of the 4 noble truths of the Buddha Dharma, and the idea is it is kind of an incrustation. Our ego self is this thing that emerges because we don't have the right kind of relationship with the rest of the world. And sort of that self, that's the self that's on the wheel of karma. And the long-term goal, going all the way back to the Hindu origins of all of this, is that the suffering is the soul, a karmic soul on this wheel for thousands of generations. And so the reformist project of Siddhartha Gautama was to show that you could make progress on that Bodhi path in one lifetime. Now with Zen Buddhism, we see that that whole conversation has gone into a really interesting philosophical direction. The Buddha Dharma teaches humans are inherently enlightened Bodhi nature, corrupted by samsara. And this is another thing that's really interesting about when you look at Chinese Buddhism, because you can really see that Taoist influence. It's the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese source from around the 5th century BCE, that starts off telling us that it is the eternal Tao that cannot be spoken and that cannot be said. That is, that sort of suspicion and hostility towards language and the contribution of language to these mental formations with which we constrict ourselves is very Taoist. It's very characteristic of Chinese philosophy, going all the way back to the I Ching, that the notion of the path is actually opening up the path because you have all these preconceived ideas. It's kind of existential that way, if that means anything, that we have to get out of these mental formations and preconceived ideas and see that we're freer than we think that we are. So, and that's very Taoist. So this idea that nirvana can't be sought using language and logic, the Tao it's the Tao Te Ching that's hard to teach right in the classroom, because again, the opening line says this Tao that can be taught and said and explained by the professor is not the eternal Tao. I mean, that's kind of what's cool about it in the classroom, but that's where the challenge comes. That's a Taoist challenge. So in any event, these are the reasons why then it looked as if there were reasons to doubt that you could through your own intentional efforts try to achieve nirvana. It's like the book of Matthew: the last shall be first and the first shall be last. It doesn't really matter when you come to God. I think there's a parallel idea there. So the central doctrinal question was whether nirvana could be achieved by goal-directed behavior at all, and if not, then what? And in China, the northern school and the southern school were the two schools that respectively said that you had to have, I think it was the southern school that said you had to have lots of discipline and work, and the northern school that said that enlightenment was something that came suddenly. I'm not talking too much about the cone practice. Cone practices are things like the meaning of life is the bowl of rice. So they actually vary greatly in terms of how significant they really are, how absurdist they are. But these short cone statements, which were really considered a high form of art, people really polished them. Some of them were very famous. And they really reflected this idea that you would have enlightenment in a sudden flash. The cone was sort of the literary equivalent of maybe even your teacher might just throw his bowl at you, just to snap you out of thinking too much and trying to get you to stop doing all that. So, Dogen worked, as I mentioned, he worked in the cone tradition, but he wasn't entirely satisfied with it. But in any event, at this point, the point is that cone tradition reflects, again, this idea that, well, you have to stop trying to have a goal. Your goal is to be enlightened, but enlightenment is not having a goal. That's the paradox. So you have to stop it. And so the cones, in their absurd aspect, among other things, are there to try and snap us out of our thought patterns, to sort of get it, short circuit it. Okay. So Zazen meaning sitting meditation. Often if a Buddhist teacher comes through your town and they're going to speak, they might call that event Zazen, sitting meditation. Sit and meditate for a while and then maybe get a short statement from the teacher and then have questions and answers. It's a nice thing to do sometimes if you notice that there's a Buddhist. In any event, first bullet point, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and Nagarjuna, the great Mahayana philosopher. Dogen saw himself like these two as a purifying reformer. You'll see the middle way, the third way, reflected a lot in a lot of teachings and titles and all of this tradition. The third way originally for Siddhartha Gautama, the idea that you can't just go into withdrawal and be a total aesthetic and not own anything, but you also can't just lose yourself in the material life of family and livelihood. That the reform that was Buddhism within the Hindu tradition was a reform aimed at a practice that ordinary people could use to make progress on the Bodhi path in their lifetime while living lives as ordinary people. Dogen's central idea is this. That Zazen, which is just itself the practice of sitting meditation, which is what? Which is just itself the practice of sitting and seeing thoughts and feelings as thoughts and feelings and sort of putting them to the side, not resisting them, but just getting back to the breath. And that's it, just mindfulness meditation. So that Dogen teaches is itself Zazen, sitting meditation, the beginning and the end of nirvana. That's just what It is, and then the prescription is Zazen only, meditation. Zen Buddhism, yes, very much about meditation. And notice now how we can see more clearly on an intellectual level why uh, the Japanese Zen tradition does have such a focus on meditation, because it's come through this Taoist filter where the teaching really is that a lot of the intellectual, linguistic, and conceptual baggage is really part of the problem, which is very Dogen, right? Um, so here's the third bullet point there on the slide. There, this is I think just an amazing statement from the Shobogenzo. If someone, even for a short moment, sits up straight in the balanced posture of the Buddha, it immediately becomes apparent that everything in the universe also exhibits the same equanimity, and that this realization spreads through all of existence. So many things to say there. Remember, in these Asian traditions, we really don't have this Cartesian mind-body distinction that we find in a lot of European philosophy, and that's something that kind of jumps out. Sometimes it jumps out here. The idea is that you are your world, and the world is your world is you. And we're actually going to get a lot more specific about that in just a minute here. So for one thing, what you're doing is not only, if it's not just this idea that, well, I have, I want to still my mind, so I will still my mind, and that'll be good for me. Like, that's a healthy practice for me. But the Zen idea is that when I still my mind, I make the world different. I'm affecting the world. And again, this is ontologically, very literally what he means. So anyway, we're going to get to that right now. Last bullet point here. Nirvana is right here. A life of practice just is nirvana. In a sense, I mean, this is where I'll end up. The fourth noble truth of the Buddha Dharma, the Eightfold Path: right conduct, right thought, right understanding, right discipline, right speech, right action, right wisdom. Right, that life, the life of following the Eightfold Path, just is nirvana. I think that's what Dogen actually teaches. So let's talk about Dogen's theories of Bodhi nature. We have like maybe 2 slides here that are going to get a little metaphysical, and then we're basically over. So as I mentioned before, I mean, in the tradition of Buddhism, of the Four Noble Truths, the picture is that human nature is basically good. The problem, as we're told in the second of the Four Noble Truths, the 12-point cycle of dependent arising, is that we are then involved in this world of craving and satisfaction, the material world, the world of samsara. And it's through our interactions with that world in our physical body that this karmic ego evolves and emerges, the one where we are defining ourselves as individuals, members of the multitude against all the other members of the multitude. That's ego, that's the ego self. And that's our gestalt as egocentric individuals that causes us to suffer in our bodies. I mean, that's really basic Buddhism right there. And again, notice that's not something that's really unusual. That's also very European and sort of Judeo-Christian. I mean, it's just original sin. You suffer because you have a body. That's certainly what Platonism teaches. So now Dogen, now remember then in this Buddhist tradition, you're trying to get that Hindu soul off the wheel of karma, and the way to do it is to sort of just disintegrate that karmic ego soul and show that it's really something that doesn't exist. Its erasure then just constitutes the emancipation of the self from the wheel of karma. So Nagarjuna telling us that everything is emptiness, very much related to Dogen's metaphysics, because it is the fact that primary being is emptiness that provides the ability for form, which is just the ongoing unfolding of the world. We'll talk about that. I know that all sounds kind of out there. But then conspicuously for Dogen, this is what I want to talk about now. Dogen says that nature is becoming, impermanence, coming to be and passing away. So there's a fundamental feature of being. And so I mentioned the Platonic tradition. Out of many traditions, this idea that there are these things that come to be and pass away, they are transient, they're impermanent. And then that would be the idea that these are not part of fundamental reality. They are not primary being. To say that something's impermanent is precisely to say that it's not primary being. Not with Dogen. Dogen turns that around. Dogen says that impermanence is the nature of true being. Okay, if we were understanding that in some other traditional or familiar spiritual discourse, the idea would be it's these physical things that are coming to be and passing away. They're just illusions because they're coming to be and passing away. But like Nagarjuna, who says that fundamental being is emptiness and void, Dogen too is counterintuitive in that he says fundamental being is impermanence, coming to be and passing away, changing. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Notice right now, the last bullet point on the slide, that is rocks that have Bodhi nature, right? Bodhi nature isn't just something that a being with Dharma, a being with experience has. Bodhi nature is the nature of everything. The universality of Bodhi nature, that everything is coming to be and passing away, that everything is impermanent, is just notice that's just another way of looking at the idea that nirvana is already there, that nirvana is already there, and it's a matter of the way that you're experiencing it. So then impermanence and time. This is kind of philosophically interesting. Let's just look at it for fun. So typically you might say that if we're trying to do basic metaphysics, sort of what is the universe, what is being, and maybe it's because of the way our language handles nouns or something, but we might say that, well, I think that the universe is an object of some kind. In fact, I was just talking the other day with someone about whether the universe itself is just a set of other physical objects, and so is itself just a physical object. Those were the terms that we were using. In any event, the issue here is, well, okay, if you think, notice the first bullet point, if you conceive of the universe as a thing, as object, then you get sort of strange intuitions about time. Like if you conceive of yourself as an object, it's sort of, you're not changing, you're kind of moving through time, or time is washing over you or something. It looks as if then you have some sort of, maybe it's contingent, or, what are the modalities of your relationship to time? But notice second bullet point, if you think of time, if you think of the universe, as the cosmos, not as an object of some sort, if that's not the grammatical role that you give it, but you think of it as an event of some sort, something that's happening. Maybe you think of the universe as a verb, I'm not sure. Then notice what happens to time then, though. Then you don't really need any more metaphysics of time. If you say that what the universe really is an event, something that's dynamic, then what you're calling time is just a reflection or a consequence of that more fundamental nature of being. That is, then it's time that follows the event. Time is just, again, another way of describing the event. This is similar to Aristotle, who has a relational view. He thinks because of their surfaces, then there's places, and then there's time. So third bullet point then, because, okay, that's nice, that's metaphysics, but we're talking about Zen Buddhism here. So, so let's get back to that. Right. So the significance of this for Buddhist practice, what's the significance for Buddhist practice and the teachings of Dogen to say that the universe is not properly conceived as an object? It's better maybe to try and conceive of the universe as an event of some kind. So it's a category of things that you're putting it in. Well, then notice this whole question of works and grace, the whole central idea that we've been talking about here. What is the intentional effort, or is intentional effort even possible? And if not, then what? As to wanting to do something to achieve nirvana. Of course, do nothing to achieve nirvana is actually not completely meaningless, and actually not unpopular either. So, all right. But there's no question of a potential transformation of the self, right? Because there isn't any self that exists across moments. There's no continuous existence. There's only the present moment on this view, because that's just another way of saying that it's this point in the event. That's what it means to say it's a moment. Just that the event is unfolding, and we're at, unfolding point XYZ, however you want. So, so that's interesting. in terms of the metaphysics of time, but it also is suggestive in terms of our Buddhist practice, because it's about the one and the many. Last bullet point, the Taoist ontology of the one and the many, a basic way of seeing that connection there between Chinese philosophy and Indian philosophy, for one thing, is that ego. The ego is the self, is the self in the multitude, the individual member of the multitude. Okay, that's the karmic self. The real self is the unity. One is not a member of the unity. There's only one unity. So the Bodhi self is causally one with everything. Now, this is the thing. So we look at Nagarjuna, at emptiness, and so on. We come away from that with this idea that everything is one thing. So each part of the universe at this present moment sort of contains within itself sort of the knowledge or understanding of all the rest of the universe, because it's all connected. Holism. Now, if we think of the universe as an event, take that a step further. That is, not only are you sort of one with everything in terms of being the same object, but when I say causally related, that is the explanation, the reason why things are the way they are with you has to do with everything else in the universe. And I think the Mahayana idea really is that any little piece of that contains within itself everything else, because everything is one. So not only the description of me, but the explanation of me and my state and my stuff is going to have to be in terms of the whole rest of the universe, because it's all just one thing. But one thing, it's all just one event. So Dogen, an interesting, the circular path, something like that. This is from the Shobogenzo of Dogen. The process is identical to the goal. So it's the Eightfold Path, the Fourth Noble Truth. The process is identical to the goal. The start of the process is the end of the process. First shall be last, and the last shall be first. As soon as you start the process, you're there. Living in the process is what nirvana just is. The practice of the Eightfold Path, again, right understanding, right wisdom, right speech, right livelihood, right action, and so on, is just identical to nirvana. That's the teaching. The Fourth Noble Truth, the Eightfold Path, is always the good news and the bad news. The good news is there's nothing magical about this, and we do have instructions. The bad news is these are the instructions. They're not really very easy. But look at this amazing, another one of these great quotations from Dogen, from the Shobogenzo. Between aspiration, practice, enlightenment, and nirvana, there is not a moment's gap. Continuous practice is the circle of the way. This being so, continuous practice is unstained, not forced by you or others. The power of this continuous practice confirms you as well as others. It means your practice affects the entire earth and the entire sky in the 10 directions. Although not noticed by others or by yourself, it is so. So the very act of Zazen, the very act of sitting meditation, you're doing it, right? Just is nirvana. Here's another couple of, fleshing that out. These aren't random, sort of looking for ones that interconnected but got to other things. Just a couple of little quotations from the Shobogenzo. Those who see worldly life as an obstacle to Dharma see no Dharma in everyday actions. They have not yet discovered there are no everyday actions outside of Dharma. Nirvana right here, how about this? Nirvana right here, in the sense of sensory experience, even just right here, right now. Nirvana right here, right now. If you cannot find the truth right where you are, where else do you expect to find it? So this is something people get so wrong about Buddhism all the time. The opposite of otherworldliness, the complete commitment to worldliness. This is it. There's no distinction between paradise and where I am right now. That's Zen teaching. Everything in the universe in 10 directions: soil, earth, grass, and trees, fences, walls, tiles, and pebbles, human artifacts, perform the Buddha's work. It's like Spinoza, when Spinoza says the whole universe is God. Dogen says, everything is becoming, but becoming, that just is the power of realization, of enlightenment. Cause is not before and the effect is not after. Again, we see that in Nagarjuna, that causality is always a two-way relationship. The child makes the parent a parent, just as the parent makes the child the child. They come to be simultaneously. That's the kind of logic. And finally, this very famous line from the Shobogenzo: the whole moon and the entire sky reflected in one dewdrop on the grass. The whole moon is inside of that drop of dew on the grass. The moon is reflected in it, but it is in it. He's always endlessly poetic this way. That's it. So, okay. So then just meant to just be a brief introduction to Dogen, the 12th century, the 13th century author of the Shobogenzo, and very much the founder of the Soto school, to be specific, but really standing out now in history as maybe the major Zen Buddhist philosopher, certainly the major founder of the Japanese Zen intellectual tradition. And someone who's quite accessible. I showed you some quotations. There's a lot. And so Dogen is someone that can be got to know better. So I commend him to you, and I'll send you some links on that stuff too, because there's lots of cool links on Dogen. You should Google it. And I shall see you. In class. Bye bye.